This is Dr. Gary Kellner, and I'd like to welcome you today to Fair Game. A few hours ago, military forces of the State of Israel and the United States attacked the Islamic Republic of Iran. This is the second such attack in less than a year. When forces of the United States and Israel attacked in June, the stated objective was to knock out Iran's capacity to wage nuclear war. Now, there were people who raised protest, some of them from the United States, some of them in other parts of the world. But there aren't that many people who really want to see a nuclear Iran. And they may feel obligated to make some perfunctory protest. But at the end of the day, a nuclear Iran is not good for the future of the world. That's where this one is challenging. If the objective is to knock out that capacity, because what we saw a few months ago is that we substantially weakened Iran, but we did not eliminate their capacity to develop and use nuclear weapons. If that's the objective, then the vast majority of the American people are going to support the president. But this is part of the problem. President Trump has been crystal clear in stating his objective over the last few weeks. But there have been other voices out of the administration. Some of them indicate that the objective is to eliminate Iran's capability to utilize ballistic missiles or to degrade their air defenses. There has been conversation about regime change. And what we know in the history of American wars is that when the American people understand why we are asking their sons and daughters to give what Mr. Lincoln called at Gettysburg the last full measure of devotion, when they understand that, they are willing, for the sake of the country and sometimes the sake of the world, to go forward. When they don't understand it, when the objectives are not clear, that is when you hear voices in the other party, sometimes in a president's own party, raising cautions. Let's take a few minutes and talk about that. Knocking out their ballistic missile capability is not going to be something that happens in 72 hours. That's something that may take a few weeks, but it can be done. Absolutely and without question, the United States can establish control of the airspace over Iran in a matter of days. Under no circumstances would that take more than about 2 weeks. But if we're talking about regime change, that's a different matter. This is not Caracas, where you're going to send Delta Force in and take the Ayatollah and his family. Tehran is hundreds of miles from the Persian Gulf. You aren't getting that done with a limited operation. The only way that happens is putting United States ground forces into that country. We haven't talked about this much. There are a substantial number of Iranians who would like to see regime change. How those same people would feel if they were invaded by the United States of America is another matter. Will they support us against their own fellow citizens? We don't know. Another part of the problem with Iran is you don't have an organized opposition, because for 47 years, successive regimes have murdered thousands of their own people, imprisoned tens of thousands, so that there is no opposition party. There's not much to work with. So if perchance we could get regime change, who in the world are we going to work with? Nobody in the administration has addressed that question, and they probably aren't able to. Now, there are certainly people in the administration who are bright and thoughtful, and they understand the things that we are talking about here today. That's not the problem. The problem is that you have to communicate the objectives to the American people, and you certainly have to communicate with their elected representatives. The Constitution of the United States, Article 1, Section 8, which enumerates the powers of the United States Congress, reserves to the Congress the power to declare war. Interestingly enough, the phrase declaration of war never appears in the United States Constitution. James Madison, who wrote most of it, spoke to that issue. He said, because there are situations where a president will have to deploy United States forces, whether Navy or Army, because of imminent danger. There may not be time to declare war. And he built in a certain amount of ambiguity into the document because the facts on the ground don't always comport with our documents. Once again, little Jimmy was right. But this isn't one of those. President Trump has been dealing with Iran now for the better part of a decade. There are people in the U.S. policy establishment who have been dealing with them far longer, 20, 30, even 40 years. The question today is the extent of the operations. If the administration can knock out their nuclear capability, even take out their ballistic missiles, we know we're not going to do that for the next 10 or 20 years, but buying time is important. Sometimes you do have to kick the can down the road because you don't have another good alternative. But what becomes far more problematic is a land assault. And even if that's not what we have on the table, the fact that the Iranians were quiescent last time around doesn't mean they will be this time. We have 40,000 service personnel on the ground in the Middle East, in bases scattered around the Persian Gulf. We have 2 carrier groups in the Middle East. What happens if Iran decides to strike back? How far does it go? Minimally, the president owes it to the leadership of both parties to bring them into the White House and explain the situation to the best of his ability. I am not suggesting that we declare war on Iran. You know, in the last 125 years, there have been more than 125 military interventions in the world for which American presidents did not seek congressional authorization. There's a handful more. They did ask for authorizations, but they didn't ask for declarations of war. Presidents of both parties have engaged in that particular approach because over the last century, the power of the executive has increased and the power of the legislature has diminished. Now, mostly the Congress has no one to blame but themselves. You know, it's been years since they've actually sent up a budget. They prefer to operate with continuing resolutions. And they abdicated a great deal of authority in negotiating treaties to the president. That's on them. But when something as serious as putting American military personnel in harm's way is on the table. And when the situation is as uncertain as this one is, the President of the United States owes it to the American people to communicate the objectives clearly and candidly. There's a lot to like about Harry Truman, the last non-college graduate to sit in the White House. And by anybody's evaluation, certainly one of the top 6 or 8 presidents of all time. But at the core of Harry Truman's leadership was a conviction, and he said that he always believed in the basic good sense of the American people. Well, we have some presidents who didn't. Lyndon Johnson didn't. Richard Nixon didn't. And it shipwrecked both presidencies. The American people can handle the truth. They don't need all the details. They don't need to see the military plans. But at the very least, if American young people are going to be in harm's way, we owe it to them and to their parents and to their spouses and to their children to be clear about why we're asking them to risk their lives. And as Mr. Lincoln said, to give the last full measure of devotion. Nothing is more precious than life. And if the pro-life movement hadn't succeeded at anything else in the last 50 years, they've accomplished this. They have convinced America that every human life is precious. This would be a pretty good time to remember that. This is Dr. Gary Kellner, and this is Fair Game.